It was the late 1960s in Northern California, a time of change, freedom, and hope. The streets of San Francisco were alive with music, protests, and a youth movement that believed anything was possible. But beneath that energy, something darker was stirring. Something that would steal not only lives, but peace itself. On the night of December 20th, 1968, two teenagers set out on what should have been a simple first date. 17-year-old David Faraday, a Boy Scout with dreams of studying science, had finally worked up the courage to ask out Betty Lou Jensen, a bright, popular 16-year-old with golden hair and a love for dancing. The two drove out in David's mother's Rambler station wagon, heading toward Lake Herman Road, a quiet stretch known as a place where young couples parked under the stars. It was a cold night, the kind where the air bites at your skin, but they didn't care. They had the excitement of youth and the thrill of something new. But somewhere in the darkness, another car pulled up. Someone stepped out. What happened next would mark the beginning of one of America's most haunting mysteries. Gunshots shattered the stillness. David was found slumped against the car, a bullet to his head. Betty Lou had tried to run, but she only made it a few steps before collapsing. Her lifeless body sprawled on the ground. 10 shots fired. 2 teenagers gone. The police were baffled. No robbery. No assault. Just cold, methodical murder. At the time, it looked like a tragic, senseless act of violence. But it wasn't random. It was only the beginning. The killer wasn't finished. He was just getting started. It was the 4th of July, 1969. Fireworks cracked across the sky, and the streets of Vallejo, California, were alive with celebration. Families gathered in backyards, children waved sparklers, and couples drove out to watch the colors light up the night. Among them was 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin. Darlene was a young mother, bubbly and full of life, known for her wide smile and the way she lit up every room she walked into. That evening, she was joined by 19-year-old Michael Mageau, a shy, quiet young man who looked up to her like a sister. They drove to Blue Rock Springs Park, a lover's lane on the outskirts of town. It was late, and the night had grown calm again after the fireworks. Darlene and Michael sat in the car, talking softly, unaware that someone was watching them from the shadows. Around midnight, a car pulled up beside them. The driver sat there for a few seconds, headlights glaring into their eyes, before pulling away. Darlene laughed it off, but Michael felt uneasy. The quiet didn't last long. Minutes later, the car returned. This time, the driver stepped out. He carried a flashlight and a gun. Without a word, he fired into the car, bullets tearing through the night. Michael screamed in pain as Darlene slumped forward, struck multiple times. The attacker walked back to his car, then, chillingly, returned. He shined the flashlight on his victims and fired again, as if making sure. Then he disappeared into the darkness. Miraculously, Michael survived, though barely. Darlene wasn't as fortunate. By the time help arrived, she was gone. But the story didn't end at the crime scene. 40 minutes later, a phone rang at the Vallejo Police Department. On the other end, a calm male voice confessed to the shooting. He described the weapon, the victims, even referenced the murders from the previous December. "I also killed those kids last year," he said, almost casually, before hanging up. For the first time, the killer spoke for himself. He wanted credit. He wanted recognition. And soon, the world would know his name. Just weeks after the shooting at Blue Rock Springs, newspapers across the Bay Area received envelopes that would shake the public to its core. Inside each one was a handwritten letter, neat, deliberate, and terrifying. The writer claimed responsibility for the murders of David and Betty Lou, and for the attack on Darlene and Michael. But these letters were more than confessions. They were challenges. Each envelope contained a strange cipher, hundreds of cryptic symbols arranged in a grid, like some puzzle pulled from the darkest corners of the human mind. The killer demanded that the newspapers print them on the front page, or else, he warned, he would cruise around all weekend, killing lone people in the night. Editors and police debated what to do. To publish would mean feeding into the killer's hunger for attention, but to ignore him could mean more bloodshed. In the end, the decision was made. The letters were printed. And then, the killer gave himself a name. "I like killing people because it is so much fun," he wrote. "I shall not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for the afterlife." This is the Zodiac speaking. The name, Zodiac, was strange, theatrical, and chilling. It wasn't just a murderer they were dealing with. It was someone who wanted to play a game, who reveled in fear, and who saw himself as untouchable. The public was riveted. Readers traced the symbols in their morning papers, trying to decode them at their breakfast tables. Amateur cryptographers and professional codebreakers alike scrambled to solve the puzzle. And then, just a week later, a married couple from Salinas, Donald and Betty Hardin, cracked the first cipher. They revealed a disturbing glimpse into the killer's mind. The message was rambling, eerie, describing his pleasure in killing and his belief that he would be reborn with victims as his slaves in the afterlife. But the final line was a taunt. "My name is," followed by a jumble of symbols that never resolved into anything meaningful. He had revealed just enough to terrify the world, but his true identity remained hidden. It was September 27, 1969. The sun was shining over Lake Berryessa, a beautiful reservoir in Napa County. It was the kind of afternoon made for picnics, fishing, and lazy conversations by the water. College students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard had found a quiet spot along the shoreline. They spread out a blanket, shared food, and enjoyed the calm rhythm of the lake. Cecilia, with her long blonde hair and soft voice, was thoughtful and kind. Brian, studying law, was intelligent and full of quiet determination. To anyone watching, they were just two young people savoring a peaceful day. But peace was not what fate had in store for them. As the couple talked, Cecilia noticed something strange. A man was walking toward them from the trees above the shoreline. At first, it seemed like a hiker. But as he came closer, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The man wore a hood, an executioner-style mask that covered his entire head. On his chest was a symbol, a white circle with a cross through it, the now infamous Zodiac insignia. In his hand, he carried a gun and lengths of pre-cut rope. Brian and Cecilia froze. The man told them he had escaped from prison, that he only needed their car and money to get away. He spoke calmly, almost rehearsed, as if reading lines from a script. He ordered them to lie down. Then, with chilling precision, he tied their hands behind their backs, securing the knots so tightly they could barely move. But he wasn't finished. Suddenly, the calm mask slipped, and the violence erupted. The hooded man pulled out a long knife and began stabbing, again and again. Brian was struck 6 times. Cecilia, 10. Their screams echoed across the water, but there was no one nearby to hear. When the attack was over, the killer walked back up to the road, leaving his victims bleeding on the ground. But before he left, he did something that showed just how much he craved recognition. On Brian's Volkswagen, he scrawled a message with a black marker. The Zodiac symbol, the dates of his murders, and the chilling record of what he had just done. Hours later, Brian and Cecilia were discovered. Brian, against all odds, survived. Cecilia, tragically, did not. Before slipping into unconsciousness, she described the hooded figure to police, the only victim to ever give such a clear account of the Zodiac face-to-face. And just like before, the killer called the authorities himself, reporting the crime with an eerie calmness. The Bay Area now knew what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a murderer. This was someone who enjoyed hunting, someone who fed off the fear he created. The Zodiac was no longer a shadow. He was a phantom who could appear anywhere, at any time. October 11th, 1969. San Francisco's North Beach was alive that night. Bright neon signs flickered over bars and restaurants. Music drifted from open doors, and cabs weaved through the streets picking up fares. One of those cab drivers was Paul Stein. He was 29 years old, working hard to save money for college. He wasn't the kind of man who made headlines, quiet, responsible, and dependable. But on that night, Paul would become the center of one of the most infamous crimes in American history. Around 9:45 p.m., Paul picked up a passenger near Union Square. The man requested a ride to Presidio Heights, a wealthy, quiet neighborhood. Nothing unusual, just another fare. But when Paul's cab pulled up to the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets, everything changed. The passenger suddenly pulled out a gun and shot Paul point-blank in the head. The killer then calmly leaned over the lifeless driver, wiping down surfaces to remove fingerprints. He even tore a piece of Paul's bloody shirt, taking it as a trophy. Then, without rushing, he stepped out of the cab, walked down the street, and disappeared into the night. What makes this murder so chilling isn't just its brutality, but how close police came to catching him. Just minutes after the shooting, several teenagers watched the entire scene unfold from their window. They immediately called police, giving a description: a man, stocky build, glasses, dark clothing. Officers raced to the scene, their sirens slicing through the quiet neighborhood. And here's the haunting part. On their way, two officers actually stopped a man who matched the description. He was walking casually near the crime scene. But due to a mix-up, the dispatcher had mistakenly reported the suspect as a black male. The officers let him go. That man could very well have been the Zodiac himself. Days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter. Inside was a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt. It was undeniable proof. The Zodiac was taunting them again, proud of how close he'd come to being caught. And still, he walked free. This was no longer just a rural nightmare haunting lovers' lanes. The Zodiac had struck in the heart of San Francisco, and the city was now paralyzed with fear. By the end of 1969, the Zodiac was no longer just a local threat. He was a specter haunting all of Northern California. Every new letter brought more terror, more demands, and more taunts. One of his most chilling threats came just weeks after the murder of Paul Stein. In a letter sent to the San Francisco Chronicle, the Zodiac described how he planned to attack a school bus, not by shooting, but by picking off the children one by one, claiming he would shoot out the front tire, then pick off the kiddies as they came bouncing out. The image alone was enough to terrify parents across the Bay Area. Suddenly, school buses were escorted by police cars. Children boarded in silence, peering out the windows in fear. For the first time, people realized the Zodiac wasn't just capable of random attacks. He had the power to paralyze an entire city with his words. Police worked frantically, combing through suspects, handwriting samples, and anonymous tips. Every crank call, every odd neighbor, every strange letter was investigated. But the Zodiac seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. He reveled in the chaos. In one letter, he mocked police directly, bragging about how easily he slipped away. He even claimed credit for murders that may not have been his, further muddying the waters, keeping investigators chasing shadows. And yet, for all the resources poured into the hunt, FBI analysts, cryptographers, multiple police departments, the killer stayed one step ahead. What frustrated detectives the most was the tone of the Zodiac. He wasn't rambling like some desperate madman. He wrote with precision, intelligence, and a chilling sense of humor. He teased the press, baited the police, and treated murder like a game only he could win. And the public couldn't look away. Front-page headlines carried his symbol. People studied his letters as if the answer might jump off the page. Coffee shops buzzed with speculation. Who was he? Was he a neighbor? A teacher? A policeman? The Zodiac's genius wasn't just in killing. It was in controlling fear. By the turn of the decade, California had never been more terrified. And the most haunting truth of all, despite their efforts, investigators weren't any closer to catching him. With every letter, every murder, and every taunt, the Zodiac left police chasing shadows. But there were men who stood out, suspects who seemed to fit the pieces of the puzzle. The most famous of them all was Arthur Lee Allen. Allen was a former schoolteacher, a troubled man with a dark reputation. He was intelligent, secretive, and often described by those who knew him as unsettling. When police searched his home, they found disturbing books about codes and explosives. He even owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch, the same logo the killer used in his letters. Allen had been fired from jobs for inappropriate behavior around children, and neighbors recalled odd, cryptic comments he made about wanting to hunt people. To investigators, he looked like the perfect suspect. But here's the catch: none of the evidence ever stuck. His handwriting didn't match the Zodiac's. His fingerprints didn't match either. When DNA testing became available decades later, it also failed to connect him to the crimes. Allen died in 1992, never officially charged, but his name continues to linger as the prime suspect in the eyes of many. And Allen wasn't the only one. Another man, Richard Gaikowski, a journalist, drew suspicion when his name appeared in anonymous tips. His appearance bore a resemblance to police sketches, and some of his writings carried a strangely similar tone to the Zodiac letters. But again, no solid evidence. Then there was Lawrence Kane, a man with a history of stalking women and neurological issues from a brain injury. Some believed his behavior matched the Zodiac's twisted psychology. Over the years, dozens of suspects emerged, each with eerie coincidences, each a possible Zodiac. But time after time, the trail went cold. The closer investigators came, the farther the truth seemed to slip away. What made it worse was the Zodiac himself. He wanted the confusion. He planted false leads, claimed murders that weren't his, and mocked investigators for their failures. Every suspect who looked promising eventually dissolved into uncertainty. And so the questions remained. Was the Zodiac an intelligent predator who knew exactly how to cover his tracks? Or was he simply an ordinary man who got lucky, hidden by the chaos he created? For every name that rose, there were holes in the evidence. And as the years passed, the truth became harder and harder to find. As the 1970s wore on, the Zodiac's voice began to grow quieter. His last confirmed letter arrived in 1974, mocking a local newspaper and signing off with his infamous crosshair symbol. After that, nothing. Had he stopped killing? Had he died? Or had he simply decided to step back, satisfied with the chaos he had already unleashed? Police never knew for sure. Some investigators believed he continued killing but stopped taking credit. Others thought he had been jailed for an unrelated crime. A few even suggested he might have left California entirely. But silence didn't mean the end. If anything, the mystery grew. The Zodiac ciphers, taunts, and threats became the stuff of legend. Armchair detectives and true crime enthusiasts pored over his letters, convinced they could solve the puzzle where police had failed. His story seeped into movies, books, and television. Each new generation rediscovered the terror, keeping his name alive long after the murders had stopped. And the case never truly closed. In 2020, more than 50 years after the first murders, a team of codebreakers announced they had finally cracked one of the Zodiac's unsolved ciphers. The message, chilling as ever, dismissed police efforts and boasted of his fearlessness. Yet, even with modern technology, the one truth that mattered most, his name, remained hidden. Decades of DNA testing, handwriting comparisons, and suspect profiles have failed to answer the question. Police files remain open, tips still trickle in, and internet sleuths trade theories late into the night. The Zodiac once promised he would never be caught, that he would live forever through the fear he created. And in a way, he kept his word. The story of the Zodiac is more than a collection of murders. It is the story of a man who turned fear into a weapon, who made headlines with codes and puzzles, and who managed to outwit entire police forces while sitting comfortably in the shadows. He remains, to this day, a faceless figure, a shadow that slipped through history, leaving behind only symbols, riddles, and grief. David and Betty Lou Darlene, Cecilia, Paul, their names deserve to be remembered. Their lives, not just their deaths, are part of this story. But for the Zodiac himself, his name is the one piece still missing. And maybe that's why the mystery endures. Because until the world knows who he really was, the Zodiac will always remain what he wanted to be, eternal. But the question remains, was the Zodiac just a man hiding in plain sight, or something far more cunning? Subscribe to this channel now, because in our next deep dive, we'll uncover the theories that could finally expose the shadow behind the mask.